So 1990, 1991, you are curious at this point on what's going on, and you start investigating. You went all the way down from the bankers all the way to the top of the Bank of Japan, and you kind of realized, Fukui, what's going on? Great. So in 86, if you can, for 30 seconds, if you can just kind of give us some perspective from 86 to 89, how much was value of real estate going up, and what kind of money were these guys making, just for us to kind of get a visualization?
Well, property prices were rising by several 100%
per year.
In total. So in this 3-4 year period.
You mean to tell me like a $500,000 property could end up being a $2 million property?
Oh yeah, of course.
You're serious?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so, and this is happening in specifically 3 years.
Yeah, maybe 4 if you add half a year on both ends.
So then how similar were interest rates? Like, you know how we dropped the rates down to 0 and we had 128-month economic expansion. Oh my gosh, what a great time it was. And then, what were they doing with interest rates? What did inflation look like? What did gas prices look like? What did unemployment look like? Was it like a 1.2% unemployment? Interest rates were really low. What were the conditions there?
Unemployment has always been low in Japan. That started to rise only from the second half of the 1990s, when the recession started to get bad. And then in the 2000s, we hit peak unemployment, which by international standards is still low, but by Japanese standards was the highest ever
in early 2000s.
In the post-war era. Yes. Inflation in the 80s was very low as well, because most money creation was going into asset prices. And so the normal measure of inflation is consumer prices. Consumer prices stayed fairly constant, fairly flat. In fact, there was some deflation because the yen was rising, import prices were going down, and so you didn't see what was happening. And that's actually the reason why, as Japan, if we quickly move to capital flows briefly, Japan was creating all this money via the asset markets, inflating asset prices, and some of that spilled over as capital outflows. That explains this flood of money, and I solved that puzzle. This flood of money from Japan was this bank credit creation in asset markets. Now, normally you'd see that, and you say, well, they're just printing money and they're buying foreign assets. The yen should go down, but it's not an automatic mechanism. Market players have to understand this and realize, they're just printing the money. That's why we're going to sell the yen, and they start to sell the yen. But this didn't happen. They saw, consumer price inflation, 0 or negative. Well, the yen, they're obviously not printing money, and the yen should be strong. And it stayed strong while they went around the world buying up assets everywhere. Now, you mentioned interest rates. Of course, it's an interesting question always, because any central bank watcher, in the mainstream, will focus on interest rates, and central banks themselves will always try to get your attention focused on interest rates. And it's a bit like the magician on stage when they're performing a trick. And of course, they don't want you to see what really does the trick. When they do that hand movement, they will distract your attention with the other hand and say, look here, this is happening. Maybe have a little diversion story. And that's what interest rates are. But it's such a huge diversion. It's worthwhile spending a few moments on this, because actually, famously, there's so many different schools in economics, right? Different schools of thought, different economists. They all have different ideas. They always argue and squabble. Well, there's one idea that all the different schools of economic thought of the last 200 years in English language economics agree on. Namely, they all say, if you lower rates, this is good for the economy, growth will go up. If you raise interest rates, this will slow the economy. You can go back to David Ricardo, classical economists, Alfred Marshall, neoclassical economics, Keynes certainly said that, monetarists said that, all sorts of new classical economics, neo-Vixelian, all the schools of thought agree on this point. And central bankers for the last 30 years have been saying this on a daily basis. Watch interest rates, because when we raise them, it's going to slow things. If we lower them, it's going to stimulate. They say this constantly. Now, because this is repeated so many times, we all assume, quite reasonably, that, of course, this has been empirically tested and checked hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times. So we don't need to check this, right? Well, how many empirical studies exist that demonstrate this relationship?
5.
0.
Wow.
There isn't one, because I did the first empirical check of this. It's very hard to publish this. Nobody, the economists don't want you to see this. But what I found is it's not true. It's just not true. There is no empirical evidence for this. So the official...
So what we're doing today in the States, when we're increasing rates to prevent from inflation taking place, that makes 0 sense to do. It's not going to help it.
It's not going to help if the real cause of inflation, which is not interest rate, is still in place. And that is money creation for unproductive purposes for consumption. If they keep doing that, and you can do that at higher rates, you can still push out the credit creation in the banking system, you will get accelerating inflation. And in fact, then you'll find that the higher interest rates make certain things more expensive, mortgages and whatever, rents will start to move up, It's not going to end inflation if the credit creation continues. So but I wanted to show this, because you can always have scenarios where maybe, you think it could work or not. So it's an empirical question. And I did the first empirical test using data on the US, the UK, Germany, and Japan for half a century. And it was open-ended. My question was simply, what actually does the data tell us is the relationship between interest rates? And we tried this together with a colleague, econometrician, and we asked, well, looking at 3 different types of interest rates, short rates, long-term 10-year government bond yields, and so on. What is the relationship between interest rates and economic growth? The official story is a negative correlation. Lower rates, higher growth. Higher rates, lower growth. So negative inverse relationship. And causation is supposed to be from interest rates to growth. There's supposed to be some causation there. What we found was diametrically opposed to this in both dimensions. The correlation is actually positive. So higher rates and higher growth always go hand in hand. Lower rates and lower growth always go hand in hand. And the causation, statistical causation that you can test for, runs from growth to interest rates. Interest rates follow growth, and therefore they can't be the cause. And that tells you that can't be the best monetary policy tool at all. That paper is published. You can also look it up. That's called, it's also open source, Reconsidering Monetary Policy. The only journal that will publish this, a fairly good journal still, but was Ecological Economics. It's in there, peer-reviewed journal. An empirical examination of the relationship between interest rates and GDP growth. We've got another paper coming out now which looks at real growth, industrial production for 19 countries. It's the same conclusion. So reality is interest rates work differently, and they're not really the cause of what's happening. But central banks love to talk about it, because that way they distract your attention. You focus on something that's not key, and they can then use that to make sure you don't really understand also what they're doing.
So if you like this clip and you want to watch another one, click right here. And if you want to watch the entire podcast, click right here.